TTM Production presents Tom Mason does an interview with. Hello, and welcome back to The Weird Side. Yes, we are back doing Tom Mason does an interview with. And if you're wondering, there's not been an interview for a while, well then check out Taskmaster World because I've done 2 interviews over there. But I digress, and we'll crack on. My guest today is best known for working on Ghostwatch. It's one and only Stephen Volk.
Hello, and good to talk to you.
So we shall start at the very beginning because Julianne
Right.
once said it was a good place to start. How did you get into writing?
Oh gosh. Well, actually, I think in my childhood, I was more interested in art. I was always drawing pictures when I was young. And funnily enough, when I think back to the pictures that I drew when I was in junior school, they were always based on the films that I saw. Or the TV shows. So it would be pictures of the Lone Ranger or the many cowboy shows that were on TV in the 1960s, or it would be the big film that I saw, Hercules Conquers Atlantis or The Greatest Story Ever Told. I quite liked biblical epics in those days, because I hadn't seen horror films. I was too young. But I loved cowboy shows and anything with action and that kind of thing. So I was kind of drawing, but also I remember my grandfather, who ran a pub, he once gave me a little pad of kind of small squares of paper. And I remember hiding underneath the table above the pub. And with these little squares of paper, I started to scribble stories like a comic strip, if you know what I mean. And each little square, so I was kind of making a storyboard in a way, and that's my first experience, I think, of putting together a story. It was only later on that I started reading short stories, and obviously I bought comics like everyone did, the Marvel comics and everything like that. But I kind of got into reading through drawing in a funny kind of way,
Yeah.
and then writing through just enjoying stories and becoming really addicted to stories, I suppose.
And then where did the passion is a good word for it. The passion of horror, where did that start from?
I think I always liked stories of unusual things because they gave a kind of excitement. I think one of my favorite stories is The Hound of the Baskervilles, the Sherlock Holmes story, where even though he explains it in the end, and it's quite a mundane explanation, it is an actual dog. But for most of the story, you have a kind of background of it being a supernatural entity in the story. And I loved the idea of someone kind of grappling with something that was unexplained. That was a terribly exciting story to me. And that was always more interesting to me than something that was about real life and everyday life, like the soap operas on TV and that kind of thing. I liked in the 1960s, for instance, there were a lot of I suppose you'd call it spy shows or adventure shows, like The Man from Uncle, or then there was Star Trek, and there was things like The Prisoner or The Avengers. They're very kind of highly stylized adventure shows that were very imaginative. Um, and I just got very intoxicated by those kind of shows as well as the stuff I was reading in the horror. I suppose my what I love about ghost stories, for instance, is that it's something that I don't actually believe with my rational mind is real, but I love the literature of ghost stories because it gives you a kind of a frisson, if you like, that you don't really get in real life. You do get spooked out. Everyone gets spooked out from time to time, but you can kind of control your fear when you read a story. So it's rather different from experiencing fear in real life.
And I think that not really believing in ghosts sort of makes the writing a lot more interesting because you can then fantasize them or you can then utilize the realms instead of going off what you believe. You
Yeah.
go off,
Well, funnily enough, I think the idea of doubt
yeah,
is what makes a ghost story. If you think about it, usually in ghost stories, the character doesn't really believe in ghosts necessarily, or they reject what they've experienced. And that's what most of us would be like. If we kind of accept it, oh, that person in the corner of the room is a ghost, it's kind of not really a ghost story. It's more it funnily enough, it becomes a kind of fantasy if everyone accepts the strange thing. But for the strange thing to be doubted
Mm,
is almost part of what makes a ghost story work, uh, to me.
yeah. And one of the things you've worked on is gone down in TV history, uh, and is one of the greatest pieces of TV media with all the stories that it comes with as well, and from viewers. What was it like working on the phenomenal Ghost Watch?
Well, I've done lots of kind of interviews over the years on that, so it's quite. Let me try and sum it up. Well, I remember going in and pitching it to the producer at the BBC, Ruth Baumgarten, and we were planning it with the same name as a conventional drama series,
Yeah,
with an investigation of a haunted house. And then she said, "Oh, the BBC isn't going to commission this as a five-part series or whatever it is. Do you think we could do it as a single drama? Because that's more likely to get off the ground." And I remember saying to her that the end of the series, that as I planned it, was going to be a live broadcast,
yeah,
supposedly in the story. And I remember being in the meeting and saying to her, "Well, why don't we just do the last bit, the last bit that says it's a live broadcast from a haunted house? But what if we pretend it really is a live broadcast from a haunted house?" And there was this kind of still moment in the room where she thought, and she said, "Well, do you think we can make it work?" And I said, "Well, let's try, you know." And it was tremendously. I remember feeling very excited that it was going to be something different. And it's even if something, you've got to believe in your heart that something's going to happen, even though nine times out of 10 with television it isn't going to happen. But I thought if we could just kind of pull this off, it could be a real kind of event. And then, of course, you just focus on it and try and make it. That's the next chunk of time, which took a couple of years to get it made. We could go back over that kind of thing. And then it went out, of course, and you remember, well, you don't remember, you weren't born then, but obviously, but if you've read about it, you know that there was a lot of complaints and that kind of thing. And the BBC ended up just kind of closing it down,
yeah,
and it was basically forgotten for kind of at least 10 years. And then actually exactly 10 years, because 10 years later the BFI brought out the DVD, uh, and it had gone silent up to that point.
yeah,
There was no kind of internet of much worth, you know. But once the BFI brought it out as a DVD, and people that had watched it back in 1992 could watch it properly, re-experience it, or maybe they'd not seen the beginning or not seen the end. They could, and this whole conversation kind of opened up, and it was very weird for me and the director because we'd gone 10 years with it being kind of shut down and kind of ignored, and there was no conversation about it. And the one thing we kind of like the idea of is that it would start a conversation about its themes, you know. But that didn't happen until 10 years later. And then people on the internet started talking about it, and she and I started going to screenings where we talked to the audience about it, and we could see how much the audience were kind of enjoying it and reliving it and that kind of thing. So it had a kind of second lease of life in the early 2000s,
yeah.
and steadily, I think its reputation has kind of stayed up there. So I feel it feels quite peculiar from something that was kind of buried by the BBC and kind of disowned to a certain extent. It kind of occupies a kind of dark corner of TV history, which I'm very proud of.
And why do you think that it's still so beloved to this day?
Um, well, I think there's a certain number of people of a certain age that just remember the experience of watching it. I mean, Leslie and I started doing appearing at screenings, people would come up quite regularly and say, "I remember seeing that," and I had to sleep for a week with the light on because I was so terrified of it. But they'd also say, and this is not, I'm not kidding, they would also say, "But even though I was terrified, I think it's the best thing I ever saw on TV. And I'm now going to make horror films because it affected me so much." And I can't tell you how many times that happened, you know. So it kind of spawned a lot of people who were both kind of traumatized, and it was the catalyst for them getting into the genre, which again, I'm not so pleased with the trauma, although obviously horror causes, trauma to a certain extent. But I am pleased that it sparked people's interest in the genre and future careers. That's a great feeling.
Yeah. And do you think that something like Ghostwatch could happen again now?
Uh, People used to say to me, "Oh, can we do it again?" And I said, "No, you can't do it again." "Oh, could we do something like it again?" And I would say, "No, I don't know. I don't know what to do. You can't remake it or do it again, especially with the internet. And I've come to the conclusion that, first of all, it wouldn't be me that would do it.
Yeah.
And secondly, I wouldn't think of how to do it because it's kind of different era completely. Media is completely different. I mean, look at us doing this. We couldn't have done this in 1992 for a start. So the next thing that's going to be a kind of ghost watch moment is not going to be done by me. It's going to be something that I wouldn't think of, which I feel quite excited about, but I don't know what it's going to be.
And
And of course, we're living in the awkward thing is we're living in such an age of fake news and fake footage, and almost everything can be faked and can be inauthentic. And
yeah,
this is the discussion of everything day in and day out these days. What can you trust? What can you not trust? And of course, back in 1992, before the internet, really, um, that really was the subject of Ghostwatch. What can you trust your eyes? Can you trust what the expert's telling you? Can you trust anything? Can you trust the news? Can you trust the guy in the studio that's giving you this information? That's what it was all about. And that's why I think we would have liked a little bit of discussion about what the drama was about instead of all the outrage about it shouldn't be allowed, heads must roll at the BBC and everything like that. As a piece of drama, it was ignored kind of as a piece of drama. It was more treated as a kind of prank,
yeah,
and we never thought of it as a prank. It was just a drama done in a particularly unusual way.
yeah. And you mentioned there about that it wasn't a prank, and I think that what really makes it really incredible is that when you see like they try and recreate a few years later. So on the last leg, Adam
Oh,
Hill,
yes, yes.
the Australian, he did that whole thing, and I think it showcases that it was such an important part of TV history that they wanted to showcase it to Adam, and then Adam got to play his own prank on them to showcase.
Yeah, yeah.
I think that
It was good fun. It was good fun. And I did a play reading once with Reece Shearsmith of League of Gentlemen, and later, I think about a year or two later, I heard on the grapevine that he was doing a live Halloween episode of Inside Number Nine, and I texted him and said, "Oh, could you, if it's going to be live, could you put in a little reference to Ghostwatch in it?" And he said, "Oh, just wait and watch it." So I watched it and I really enjoyed it. Obviously, I'm sure you've seen it,
yeah.
but I texted him and said that was great, and he rather touchingly texted me back and said it was all for you. So I thought that was lovely.
Yeah, and I think that Deadline, which is the episode you alluded to,
Yeah,
it works so well because it's had that love from Goldson and it had that sort of passion. You can sort of see the similarities, and it's like you watch it once and then you realize what's going on, and when you watch it again, you get another aspect. Do you think that that's why people watch Ghostwatch? I rewatch it a lot because they see different things they didn't see.
well, I would say that if I enjoy something, you watch something once for well, the initial impact, and then I guess because I'm a practitioner in it, I'm quite happy to watch something again and kind of more with a skeptical kind of like, how does this work? How is this set up, both in the writing and the directing and everything, or maybe even a third time. And especially if you think something is clever in the way things are set up or that kind of thing, or um, you know, uh, it becomes more analytical the more you watch it, really. But I wonder whether there's also a thing with Ghostwatch because there's this kind of slightly silly thing that people are trying to spot the ghost in the background. How many times is the ghost actually there in the background, which was always something that the director did as a kind of Money in the Bank
Yeah,
because there was always a worry at the BBC that we didn't show the ghost enough. It's hardly mentioned really in the script that you'd see anything. And I think the director thought, well, we better cover our options by having him in the background in case we need to, kind of show something.
yeah,
Um, so I think she put him in about 8 or 10 times. I can't remember these. There's a lot of internet gossip about how many times he
yeah,
appears in it, which is quite fun
yeah.
over the years.
And I think that it reminds me of the whole trying to find out who, like, how many times did the fifth housemate and the young ones spot
Oh
him.
yes.
And I think that it showcases that the people want to find out these mysteries, want to find these things, and it
Yeah,
makes, I think it makes the thing more interesting because then you're doing an investigation of your own. You can feel like you're
yeah.
involved in your own viewing
I
because
mean, the whole thing that really intrigued me about the concept of Ghostwatch to write it was, and I don't know whether I really consciously realized this at the time. It's only many years later that I realized kind of what I was doing, is it's all about the audience watching. In a way, the audience watching is the main character because they are kind of they want something to happen. They've been given an opportunity. Okay, watch this program and you will see a ghost. So they're tuning in to watch a ghost happen. Okay. And then when it starts to go wrong and things start to happen, the person watching is responsible for that. I guess it's rather like, that or that kind of voyeuristic thrill that people got from the early days of Big Brother, where you vote someone off, or you think someone's nasty Nick or whatever, or you like that person, you don't like that person. It's on a lot of shows now with like traitors and all the rest of it. But the audience being kind of all powerful in terms of what they can be involved, but they're still at a kind of distance. It's real kind of so there's a distance of responsibility,
yeah,
and I kind of wanted that to be part of the process of watching this. It's basically a ghost story, obviously. That's the main thing it's supposed to achieve. But also the idea that the audience is kind of culpable in wanting certain things to happen. You know what I mean? So when they're faced with the little kids being traumatized in the drama,
yeah,
it's kind of like they've asked for that. They've tuned in and they've kept watching it, even though they know that's happening. You know what I mean?
yeah,
So that's the kind of idea I was playing with.
yeah. And one of the other things you worked on, which is equally as brilliant, what was it like working on ITV's Afterlife?
Um, I really liked that. I think it was a great experience. I can't say I like it as a piece. That's very arrogant. What I mean is I like the experience of doing it. I've always wanted, I say I kind of grew up
Yeah,
loving those shows in the late 60s, the kind of investigator shows, like Department S and the shows where there's a mystery and there's a story of the week that
yeah,
someone solves, and then there's a story next week and that kind of thing. That's kind of gone away now. But I always liked the idea of a kind of investigator show that was about the supernatural. And they're very few and far between until the X-Files came along. There was there wasn't there wasn't any investigator of the supernatural, I don't think. There's Kolchak, I know in America, and that very few though compared to cop shows. And I always thought that was something back to the Hound of the Baskervilles. I always thought, there's something in that kind of Sherlock Holmes and the supernatural or that kind of thing. Um, and it was really a call from someone, a producer that wanted that kind of show as a kind of British X-Files. And I kind of responded with this idea of about a medium because I thought a medium is really a kind of inbuilt idea for a TV show because it's someone that people go to the way they go to a private detective. They go to it's a consultant's kind of job.
yeah,
So you could get a story every week. Different people go there, so you can have these kind of a short story every week that builds into a narrative. So I was very pleased with that. Had a lovely team to work with on it that were, I think, for me, they felt equally involved in the storytelling as I was in a way, and that made for a very secure kind of relationship. And the actors were great and wonderful to work with, which I really enjoyed.
and why do you think that the element of story of the week isn't as utilized as it once was?
I think because the nowadays the imperative is to get people to tune in next week. Don't just watch this episode, but you have to watch the next episode. It's all about chasing those viewing figures and getting people addicted to a show that's going to be 6 episodes or 10 episodes or 5 seasons, which I think in some ways really works. There's always been serials, as we used to call them. But there were also things that were stories you could dip out of. You could watch The Saint, for instance, or something like that. You just watch one episode with Roger Moore. You don't have to watch the next one.
Yeah,
But they don't kind of want you to, they don't want to lose that audience that's tuned in for one.
yeah,
It's why it's so difficult, and believe me, I've tried. It's very difficult to get an anthology show off the ground, the way Tales of the Unexpected and these kind of things, or the Twilight Zone. It's quite difficult to get those off the ground because of that reason that you've got an individual story and there's no incentive to tune in next week, kind of thing. Really, I think it should be there should be both. There should be lots of it should be all about the good having good ideas.
and I think that there is a steady, well, not as much anymore because of Volk now ending, but there was for a brief period there was a steady incline of like Inside Number Nine and Vera were the type of what I would call heavy hitters in the category of showcasing that you can still make a
Yeah,
credible story even when you know it might be reset and you might not remember, you might not
yeah.
be discuss that thing. And do you think that audiences have developed to saying that these type of shows could still exist?
Um, I don't know whether I think if you ask, it's very dangerous to ask audience what they would like. It's easier to show them something and say, "Do you like this?" rather than say, "What would you like?" And I think there's almost a kind of industry in itself about trying to second guess what people want, especially trying to second guess what commissioning editors want. And usually they're chasing what's just been a hit.
Mm.
So I suppose it would require something to go back to that story of the week, case of the week kind of format that to become a big hit.
Yeah,
And then they would say, "Oh, let's go back to that then." It's as simple as that, really. I don't think there's any great intellectual. It's part of probably the streaming
yeah,
is probably part of why, watching a 10-parter and having to binge watch and the ability to kind of binge watch something, that's actually a physical difference. I mean, you couldn't binge watch something 30 years ago because there were only a certain number of channels. You had to wait till next week to get the next. That's the way the schedules were done on a weekly basis. So you had an episode on a Monday night at 9 o'clock, and it would be next a week later before you saw episode two. You couldn't watch the box set. That all came about really maybe 20 odd years ago with HBO, I think was the first, thing to start those like The Sopranos, and you'd have the whole series kind of thing, really.
yeah. And following on the back of what we were talking about, the other thing you've worked on that's in the same realm, what was it like working on the audio of Afterlife Lost Loved One?
Um, well, that was quite nice. I mean, it's 20 years after the series. We finished doing the series 2006. Um, and me and the producers were talking about, if ITV recommissioned the third series, what would we do, given that one of our main characters had died at the end? What would we do now to prolong it? But as it turned out, they said, you know what? We don't want to do any more, and we don't want to do any drama on a Saturday night anymore. Not just your drama, but any drama.
Yeah,
We just want Saturday night to be light entertainment. So and as I said to the producer, couldn't you say we'll do it on another night? He said, you don't get that conversation once they've decided. So it was kind of off, and we were all very sad about it, especially the actors, because the actors enjoyed being a part of it, and enjoyed each other's characters. So that was sad. And then about about what was it 20, yeah, about 20 years later, I think it was the idea of made me think about the spirit world and mediums and people being surrounded by death in the family and that kind of thing, and how, for instance, in the Civil War in America, after the Civil War, there was a rise in spiritualism, and there was a rise in spiritualism after the First World War last century. And I thought, well, what would what would be the equivalent of that? And then I thought, hang on, I've got a character in Afterlife that could explore that. Um, so that, and she used to be her backstory was that she used to be a nurse.
Yeah,
So I thought, hang on, would she go back and would she have gone back to work in the NHS as they asked nurses to do? And then it became kind of intriguing to pick up on Alison 20 years after she was with Robert in Afterlife and what her life would be like. I often used to when we go over to Bristol, which is quite near me, about 40 minutes drive, I'd go over there for various reasons, and I'd always think, "Oh, where's Alison? What's she up to? What's she doing with her life?" So it was an opportunity to pick up on this character.
yeah,
I knew we couldn't go back to ITV and do it as a drama, so I wrote to the production company and I said, "How would you feel if I did this as a story?"
yeah,
And they said, "Fine, do what you like with the character because ITV have said no to it." So I wrote it first of all as a story, uh, and then I knew Simon Barnard who'd produced Hammer Chillers,
yeah,
which were little chiller stories based on not based on, but under the Hammer label. And he got Leslie to come in and record the story for us, which was good fun. Good fun to meet up with her and talk about old times when we'd had fun shooting in Bristol.
yeah. Why do you think that it's? Why do you think that that type of way of utilizing characters from well-beloved things have become more popular? Because there's quite a few other shows where they've been cancelled and they've come back years later in audio. Why do you think that that's become a popular way to sort of give the audience the a good send off for the characters?
I think from a commercial point of view, I think there's what do they call it? They in movies they call it a legacy reboot, don't they? A kind of legacy is the word that they bandy around. I think there's a sense of nostalgia about it. I think if you have a fondness for a drama show, you get very involved with the characters and you feel almost sometimes, I'm not talking about my own characters, but I'm talking about the shows that I love. You almost feel quite bereft and you feel a sense of loss when it's gone. I remember feeling tremendously grief-stricken at the end of 6 Feet Under when that was all gone, and the whole family you felt they were such a real part of your life,
Yeah,
and then they're kind of gone that I think there is a kind of pang that if you can pick up on it. I mean, what I think happens, unfortunately, is sometimes people try and recreate the thing that's gone and it doesn't quite work or it doesn't quite come together, and then it's almost like Dexter, for instance, was revived and didn't quite work, and then it was revived again. And I haven't seen the new one, whatever. And it's kind of like trying to capture lightning in a bottle of a certain time. So I don't know. People say the latest reincarnation of Dexter is really good, but sometimes maybe it's better to leave it. I don't know. You got to also if something gets decommissioned or doesn't get recommissioned, sometimes you've got to get your head around that and just say, okay, at least in the case of Afterlife, at least we got 2 seasons and it had an ending. I
yeah,
hate it when shows don't have an ending,
yeah,
especially if you're really dedicated to it and it's kind of left on a cliffhanger
yeah.
and then it's gone. I really dislike that.
Yeah, and I know that because of there's vast amount of cancellation. I know that there's a few writers now that go in the idea of right, we've got this first series, we'll end it so that even if it doesn't get commissioned, it's a good ending for the whole
Yeah,
show. But if it does get recommissioned, there's
yeah,
added in bits where you can see it return.
yeah.
Is
Well,
that
that's what I definitely did at the end of the first season of Afterlife because it kind of gave the impression that Alison might have died.
yeah,
Um, because I hate so much not having an ending of something. It just really, we worked really hard at having an ending that could be open-ended, but it could also be an ending if you don't get a chance to do more. And the same with the second season. It's an ending. If we've got to do
yeah,
more, we do more. If it doesn't, we don't kind of thing, really. And I think that the shows that I really like, I think, I know what hard work it is to actually figure out how to do that, you know, and I admire shows that have a season, have an ending, have a second season, have an ending, but they still build on it. That's quite a clever thing to pull off, you know.
Yeah, and as a writer, does that give you satisfaction when you have worked out what the ending is, so that when if it doesn't get recommissioned, you're not now keep on thinking about it because you know that in your head that you
Well, the
said,
funny thing about Afterlife was I knew the very ending before I started. It was the most peculiar thing. I wouldn't say I kind of it came to me in a dream, but it was almost one of those daydream kind moments
yeah,
where I had a really strong feeling at the beginning when I was figuring it out, where I kind of had this scene pop into my head where a large guy, large black guy
yeah,
with wearing a mask comes out of a house carrying her, and a train is passing by, and he lies her on the ground, and she might be dead.
yeah,
That which is exactly what happens at the end of the first series. And this thing, I was absolutely convinced. And the weird thing was, I was so convinced that that felt right that I had to figure out who is the guy, why is he wearing a mask, what house are they in, where's the train coming from,
yeah.
and yet I didn't think, well, I can change all that. It was such a powerful kind of image in my mind that I knew I had to get to it eventually, you know.
Yeah.
So it was the subconscious working, and then I had to kind of consciously work out how to get to the subconscious moment.
Yeah, and one of the other things you've worked on, which is in a different medium, but you can also do so much with it because it's like you can do so much as there's a lot of things in this area when you watch it does do. What was it like working on the play Answering Spirits?
Um, yes, that was a strange that was a bit of a strange one. That was, I think, comes from my reading horror and supernatural things when I was a teenager. And I started to read a lot of non-fiction books about the history of psychical research and the paranormal and the Society for Psychical Research in Victorian times and this kind of thing, and also the history of spiritualism. And I got very interested in that. And I read about how spiritualism originated with the three Fox sisters in the 1848 in Hydesville, New York State in America. And I read about these two little kids in the house that was quite isolated, and they start to hear that knocking, and they start to interpret one knock for yes, two knocks for no, and all the rest of it, as we know from spiritualism. And it all came from these two kids in this farmhouse. And I thought, oh, that sounds like it would be a good spooky drama. So I looked into it and started to research it. And then the more I read about their lives, the three sisters' lives as they became older, and the religion they created took hold and spread like wildfire. Uh, and it became more about kind of politics and psychology. And the weird thing was, I started to think this isn't a supernatural story at all. This is actually just a story of human beings creating something that gets out of control. And in a way, it's parallel idea to Ghostwatch, someone creating something that gets out of control. And it seems to be something that I write quite a lot about people's imagination just being uncaged, you know, and causing damage. So it was a similar kind of thing. And I realized that what I was writing wasn't really a ghost story type play. It was more a kind of skeptical kind of thing. It never says in the play that ghosts exist or anything. It just is about these people that create this cult that becomes a religion, and it kind of ruins their lives, basically, is what happens. So that became fascinating, and we took it up to the Edinburgh Festival, got some good uh, reviews. But I always thought of all the things I've written, I just thought it was one of those stories that sets your mind alight, and you thought, why has this not been a film, a play, or something? It's a kind of important story about real people. Why is it not kind of like a big thing that it felt like I'd discovered something that hadn't been told before, you know? So I was glad we put it on stage. I would like it eventually to have become TV series or movie or something like that, but um, it wasn't to be. Actually, I remember writing it as a script as well, but at that time, Hollywood wasn't really interested in any film with three women leads. They were only after something that Tom Cruise could be in or Tom Hanks. They had to have a Tom in it, and there were no Toms in that script.
Yeah. And as a writer, when you're writing your work, are you the type of person that listen to a particular soundtrack or a particular style of music that's based on the genre that you're working on, or do you just work in pure silence?
No, I do listen to music, and funnily enough, I went to a meeting of a bunch of horror directors and writers in London on Sunday, called Masters of Horror. Mick Garris, an American producer, organized a UK get together of a lot of directors like Neil Marshall, Chris Smith, and the League of Gentlemen guys, and a few other people that I know. And one of the things I asked them was, when you're writing, do you have a soundtrack? And I mean, I do. Look, this is what I've got: Mulholland Drive, Joker, Carnival. Then I've got Hilda Gudmundsdóttir, and I've got something else there, and then I've got The Road. So as they said to me, every different project has a kind of, soundtrack, has a playlist,
Yeah,
because I think it helps psychologically get into a zone in your mind. It kind of cheats you into thinking it's an actual film as well. So you've got background music for the film you haven't made yet, kind of thing. But it also cuts out the outside world and puts you in a dramatic space. So I really like soundtracks in particular.
yeah,
You know, I've got I've got The Village here. Oh, The Revenant.
yeah, yeah, and
Loads.
yeah.
So yeah, I tend to have a playlist for every project, really.
Yeah, and I think it is one of those things where you sort of your brain then sort of works in a way of ah well I'm hearing the like spooky trees so I can write this thing and I might want to set of someone dying in a woods and it's sort of do you think that that's why that works so well because it helps you
Yeah, it's a way of, as I say, it's a way of getting in the zone. So I've got, for instance, the village here. The village. It's not one of my favorite films, but it's got a kind of bucolic, kind of arboreal, kind of countryside kind of feel to it. It's quite lyrical. Um, and I mean, I don't know why I've got Mulholland Drive here. That's much more kind of jazzy and kind of modern. The Joker is more kind of disjointed,
yeah
so it gives you a kind of edge of strangeness. So by having different ones, it gives you a different complexity of things. But sometimes it's just to fill in, like you say, it's so that you're not sitting here in the silence of your own kind of blank page. It's bad enough looking at the blank page without hearing a blank page. And I remember in America, I was working on a script at Columbia Pictures, and I had a little cassette player in those days, and I had one soundtrack which was Batman, the
yeah
Tim Burton Batman,
yeah
and I played that over and over non-stop all day. And that was the soundtrack because the script I was working on was a kind of a movie based on kind of fairy tales and that kind of thing. So the Danny Elfman, I'm sure you're familiar with that, Danny Elfman and Tim Burton's composer. So that kind of thing again kind of just was a shortcut really to get me in the atmosphere of it.
yeah and as we've got to this point in the interview and people got to know you more what advice would you give someone that might be watching this that would want to get into the world of writing in general.
Um, I would say try and be aware of what's happening in the market, as they say. So be aware of what's happening. But usually the things you're watching around you were things that were commissioned maybe 2 years ago, if not longer. So people are already looking for things that are different from what you're watching. So be aware of what you think, films that work, films that don't work. Don't be obviously old-fashioned. But on the other hand, I think what never goes out of fashion is what you feel in your own heart about the world around you. In other words, do something that you're passionate about rather than what you think other people will want to see. Because you'll never be wasting your time if you do something, if it comes from a place of your own personal passion. If you try and second guess what someone else wants, you could just get it wrong, or it could be something that someone else has already done. But if you're doing something from a point of view of you believe in it,
Mm,
integrity will never be out of fashion. You know what I mean?
yeah. And one of the other things you worked on that the title alone would signify that it's this really intriguing thing because the concept is really intriguing. What was it like working on Cyclops?
Oh, Cyclops. Oh gosh. Oh, that was a strange one. That was uh well, that was a commission from Channel 4 for a series called Shockers, and it was based on they're all based on kind of cameras and technology. That was the brief. Um, and I had again, it's a little bit about the voyeurism concept that I was talking about when I was talking about Ghostwatch, but it was about the idea of it. It came from the idea of when criminals were let out of prison and have ankle tags, as they still do, you know what I mean, to keep an eye on them. And I thought, well, what if one of these criminals had a camera inside his eye so you could literally keep an eye on what he was seeing and doing every single moment of the day, you know? So that was the concept. And the idea was that his probation officer starts to vicariously experience this man's life and get involved in it in a way that's quite disturbing. So that was the pitch and that was the concept. As I remember it, it's a long time ago, but that was my going into it really.
Yeah, and when working on something like that, do you have to do a lot of research into the system, what it is currently to know how you?
I did at that time. I mean, I talked to a probation officer. There's two schools of thought. One is you do all your research before you start, and then the other thing is just map out your story and then check with someone so that you've got the details right. I tend to do, I think, both in a way. I think if you're working on something and you think, hang on, I'm faking this because I don't know, and you say to yourself, oh, I think I'll get away with this, then that is a kind of yellow light that's flashing to tell you to go, don't mess around, go and find out the true stuff rather than pretending um and I always think you can tell if you're reading a book and someone's describing a drug dealer or something or a gangster and you think, oh, you know what, they've never been anywhere near that kind of character. You can just see it's really obvious, and you don't want to be caught out like that. Also, I don't want to uh, people to complain about something in something I've written that you could have got right. So I always, when I'm researching something, for instance, prison in, I went to visit a prison in Bristol to check out what uh, uh, prison officers what they did and that kind of thing. And one of the things I said was, "What's the thing that most annoys you when you see prison officers on TV?" That's what I always ask, uh, whoever I'm asking. And he said, "It really annoys me when they wear hats because we never wear hats when we're walking around prison." So I said, "All right, no hats," things like that. And it's usually kind of common sense. I did 6 months research about blind people because I was writing a thriller about someone that was blind. Um, and they tell you things like, oh, when you open a door, if you're living with a blind person and you're opening a door, you either have it open or you have it closed. Don't have it half open because someone's going to walk into the side. It's kind of obvious. It's obvious when someone tells you, but it's not so obvious when you don't know that world.
And do you reckon that the people that the world you're inhabiting, do you reckon that they appreciate the work more because you've asked the people directly what they don't like from when other people have attempted to do?
Well, I always do it on the basis of I want to get it right, and you're the person that can help me get it right. So if you don't help me, then people are going to go on getting it wrong, kind of thing. But of course, I always say then you realize this is a drama, not a documentary, and it's part of maybe, I've visited some traffic cops, for a horror film. I had to say to them, "Oh, it's a horror film, but there's some scenes with traffic cops. Could you tell me, how you get a message on the radio? What would they say on a radio if they're reporting such and such? I've got a friend that used to be a copper, and I quite often have a story, and I'll say, there was a really interesting, oh yeah, how would you say on the phone if you've got found a dead body? And she said, you say foxtrot. They use foxtrot, meaning fatality. It stands for the letter F, which means fatality. So they could say it on the radio because they don't want someone to say, "Oh, there's a dead person here," and someone overhear them that might be a relative. So they might say suspected foxtrot,
Yeah.
which you'd never make it up. But once you're told it, you think, "Oh, that's great." You know, no, not great in itself, but just the authenticity of that is a nice thing to put in the story.
Yeah, and then you help make it more, even though it's, as you said, it's a drama, you help to make it slightly more realistic to a point where the audience can go, I relate to that person, or that is
Yeah.
accurate to my place of work. Do you
Well,
think?
it's especially important when as I say, I'm always writing things that are implausible, if not downright impossible. So because that's the game that I'm playing, I think it's even more important to make the trappings around the impossibility in the story, like ghosts or whatever, monsters or whatever it is, then you try and make everything else plausible. That's part of the craft of it, really.
And one of the other things you worked on, which was also brilliant, is I'll Be Watching You. What was it like working on that?
Well, that was part of the same. Sorry, it wasn't part of Shockers. It was another anthology show called Ghosts, not the comedy one that's on the BBC, but long time before that. But and that actually that actually came from an idea that I had when I was still in school about kind of astral projection and this idea that you can leave your body, out of body experiences and that kind of thing. And I was still in school when I had this idea, yeah, which is, believe me, a long time ago. Um, and I had that idea of someone leaving their body and getting away with murder and then coming back to their body. That was the concept, and I wrote it as a story and then put it in a drawer and that kind of thing. And then when I was many years later given the opportunity to do something for ghosts, I thought, well, it is a ghost in a way. I kind of, the ghost leaves the body, does something. And then I thought, well, what if this guy is in prison? That that's what I did the research for, by the way. This prison story. Um, uh, what if he's in prison and he can't get his revenge on someone, but he can because he learns how to leave his body and go and so I had this kind of like character that's a kind of London gangster, and then he finds out that his wife is having an affair, and then he leaves his body and goes to visit her and that kind of thing. So yeah, we had some fun doing that. The trouble with those were they didn't have a lot of time to shoot them and they didn't have a lot of expense, but they really pulled them off quite well in the end. So
And
it's quite fun.
why do you reckon that an anthology series like Ghosts, why do you think that that works so well in its concept?
Well, I think I said earlier they're really difficult to sell. Because there's not a continuity of audience. So from the broadcaster's point of view, there's no imperative to tune in next week. But from the creative point of view, the good thing is that you can tell a whole story in like 45 minutes. And especially with horror, sometimes horror stories, as you know, are quite short. It's kind of you just get in, there's a scene, there's another scene, and you get out again. It's very difficult to maintain horror for a kind of feature length, really. Supernatural horror, I'm talking about. But you can't, it's easier to do for kind of 45 minutes than it is for 90 minutes. So it's very appealing for people like me, I think, to write a 40 or a 45-minute supernatural story. You can you can be very concise and kind of get away with it without having to have a three-act structure, like half an hour build up and then a middle act and then a big climax. 90-minute or 100-minute films force you to have big climaxes because they've got to build to something big, whereas a 40-minute story can be a bit more down key and a bit more subtle because it doesn't have to build, if that makes sense.
And why do you think? in the modern day and age, why do you think that horror is still so popular to a large audience?
Oh gosh, I wish I knew the answer to that. Um, there's always frequently an article, usually in the Guardian, that says why is horror suddenly trendy? And, and it's one of the things we were laughing at the weekend because to us horror is always around.
Yeah,
There's these spikes, there's peaks and troughs, and suddenly there's a big hit. Like this summer there was Bring Her Back and Sinners, and they said horror has returned, and it's like, excuse me, horror's always been there, Or they say, why are vampires suddenly trendy? No, vampires have always been, there's always vampire films.
yeah,
It's just one becomes suddenly successful, and we're all doing it all the time. But so it's more the fluctuations of the market that makes them suddenly prominent. I think what's good now is that you've got individual filmmakers with real voices who are making films in their own terms. There's Mike Flanagan, there's Oz Perkins, there's the two guys that did Talk to Her, who I can't remember their names. I'm sorry, the two brothers. And Jordan Peele is another one. Who are making who love the genre and are just making those films, and they're not kind of studio films, and they're not kind of art house films. Although I do like Nosferatu and stuff like that. I think of that as kind of art house horror. So I'm not saying anything against that genre, but they seem to be confident in the voice of horror within the genre and just saying, no, this is horror, and they're not embarrassed about it because there's terrible snobbery in this country against horror because it's the kind of video nasty era still in people's minds, and people are very sniffy about it and look down their nose at horror. But I think especially in America, there's no, it makes money. You can do it. You can make it cheaply. It makes money. Let's do more of them, kind of thing. Blumhouse has proved that, and so I don't think it's a sudden thing. I think there are certain things like there was a peak when Blair Witch Project, because I think what engendered that was that camcorders were so cheap and so mobile that you could make a horror film in your back garden with your mates, and it could actually make money. You could actually get it on because horror films don't need stars in them. So if you've got an inventive idea, you can make it yourself. You don't even need a studio. You can just do it. So there was that phase, and now I think we're in another phase, which is the more imaginative filmmakers that are thinking that horror is a kind of gateway to real imaginative cinema.
yeah. And with having horror being in this sort of day and age when you see a lot of horror films doing really well and a lot of people are talking about them in the world of theatre, do you think that horror works? Why do you think horror works so well in theatre?
Uh, oh, you mean on stage, or because Americans say theater, they mean cinema?
I mean,
Cinema.
on
You
stage.
mean on stage? Yeah. Um, yes, that. I don't know actually. That complete. I have to say, it kind of throws me that because I feel sometimes that horror moments in the theater don't work
Yeah,
because I'm always aware of the artifice of the proscenium arch and the artificiality of sitting in an audience and the stage in front of me. I think you can frighten people, like, in The Woman in Black, you have a very loud noise coming out of the speaker right next to my ear hole. And I find that just irritating.
yeah,
And okay, people might say, "Oh, I love that jump scare." I don't really like jump scares and stuff. I want stories to get under my skin and that kind of thing. But but when it comes to, I guess, drama is about actors transporting you, and you can be transported by someone on a blank stage just telling you a story, just using the words, you know. I remember I did a thing actually with Reece Shearsmith on a stage thing at the Bush Theatre in London, and it was just two actors just talking. It was actually they were reading it. Hadn't even learned it. It was a rehearsed reading. And someone afterwards said, "Oh, I thought it was so frightening. I almost fainted." I said, I said they were just reading it. All they were doing was reading the words. It was like, how can you be so overcome with horror when you're listening to something and just watching actors read it? But it shows, I guess, the power of storytelling, which everything is about when it comes down to it.
Yeah, and I think that what really works it for the theatre is that you have. I really like watching those videos because you see when they talk about where they have the audience and you, it's like just them screaming because you
Yeah,
get to see that they're genuinely terrified. I know that Mitchell Webb have now done a sketch based on it to
yeah,
say,
yeah, yeah.
but
I remember going to see Ghost Stories. I don't know if you've seen that on stage. You've probably seen the film. But everyone was all these kids. Well, everyone's kid to me. Everyone's younger than me. But what I mean is they were quite young, but they were kind of all hyped up even before it started, and they were all whispering and oh my God, I can't believe it. It's like they were just in a state of nerves even before the curtain went up. And I thought that was a magnificent kind of bit of marketing to actually get the audience in that state before anything's happened.
And so, as we draw a close to this interview, we I know that there's rife with NDAs, and NDAs are like evil because they're everywhere. And you hear a lot of people complain about them. What upcoming projects that you're allowed to talk about that are you excited for people to see slash hear?
Oh, yes, that always comes up. Trying to think what I can say about. Really, lately I've been working on short stories that are too not too numerous, but they're too kind of in different states, in different publications. So it's a bit complicated to talk about them all. But there's I've got quite a few short stories coming out. I'm working with a New Zealand director on a script that I'm very, very excited about, but I can't say anything about that. But I do have a book coming out in November. It's a ghost story, and it's going to be called. It will be called The Confirmed Bachelors, and that'll be coming out from Black Shuck Books in November. It's just a little book, but a little something, a ghost story for Christmas from me.
And so, without giving away your home address, where can people track you down online?
Uh, you can, uh, my website is on stephenvolk.net, and you can't find me on Twitter because I've chucked that in the bin, but you can find me on Facebook.
And so, there we have it, another excellent, wonderful, and amazing interview. Thank you for letting me interview you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been good, Tom. Thanks.
And thank you guys for watching. And remember, no, I've forgotten.